Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're taking a look at a weapon that isn't quite forgotten yet. This is Brandon Herrera's AK50, and I'm here visiting, and I figured it'd be really cool to take a look at this, not just the current iteration of it, but also the V2 and the V1. So what we've got for you today is the full evolutionary process of almost 10 years of AK50 development. And there's still, this isn't quite the finished product yet. We'll get to where it's going at the end. But at the beginning, we're set in 2016. Brandon Herrera is basically just out of high school. He's playing with some AK building in the garage, likes the platform, thinks it's really cool. And the concept is like, hey, how about scaling up the AK to 50 BMG? Like, how hard could it be? The answer, by the way, spoiler, is actually quite difficult. That's not easy at all. But at the time, you know, seems simple enough. AKs are cheap and readily available and easy to work on, so let's just make a 50 caliber one. So he actually makes a dummy mock-up 50 cal AK out of aluminum. It's actually, these are a couple bits of it, takes it to SHOT Show, puts it out on a table, and like there's a lot of interest. This is theoretically going to be the cheapest semi-auto 50 cal rifle on the market because, hey, AKs are simple and cheap, right? Fortunately, he was apparently fairly quickly relieved of that notion because it turns out like AKs are not cheap and are not super simple. AKs are elegantly put together, but there's a lot of detail and a lot of complexity that goes into them appearing to be simple and super reliable. So with the aluminum mock-up out of the way, there's serious intent to like, let's actually do this. Let's make it happen. So the very first version of the gun, V1, is Brandon Herrera and a local gunsmith near him named Chris Baker. And the two of them set out to make a functioning gun. And as you can see here, they pretty clearly copied a milled receiver AK in a lot of its details, and actually made it mostly work. So let's take a closer look at this, and then we'll come back and talk about where the project went next. All right, if you look at the side here in the lightning cut, it's a little hard to read, but AK50E, serial number 0001. This is the first one. Unfortunately, as is so common of developmental prototype firearms, the bolt and carrier have been lost over the years. Several of the other parts, like the gas block, were repurposed onto later iterations of the gun. So all that remains of it is this barreled action. The barrel was a turned down Browning M2, surplus Browning M2 machine gun barrel. This actually has a barrel extension added to it and then set into what is clearly a replica of a milled AK receiver. Would have taken, or did originally take, a standard AK fire control group, which is kind of funny. Like, you know, the guns are about 200% scale, but still uses the standard original fire control parts. And, well, there's not a whole lot to see here, but this was version number 1. By the time it came to the end of its useful life, it was able to fire, extract, and eject, but never successfully feed cartridges. So with version 1 of the gun half working, like it would fire, it would extract and eject, but it wouldn't feed. Okay, lessons have been learned. There are fundamental issues with that milled receiver. Like at this point, the proper next step is to start from scratch with a new base gun. And they decide to go to a stamped receiver at this point, not because that's the requirement of AK evolution, but rather because the stamped sheet metal receiver, or kind of press, break, bent sheet metal receiver, is a lot more economical than making milled, fancy, feature-rich receivers. So we evolved to variation 2, V2 of the gun. This guy, the big old stamped receiver, and this begins circa 2019, and at this point it's Brandon Herrera, and he's brought in like half a dozen interns, excited young gunsmiths. The whole program he puts together is called Brass Valley, and these guys, working collaboratively, figure out how to turn the V1 into a gun that will actually feed as well as fire and eject. And this project takes several years of work and ultimately culminates in some pretty cool video that's Herrera posts on YouTube of this thing functionally, successfully firing off of a Bren gun tripod. And it was almost fully reliable. So let's take a look at what specifically went into V2. All right, version 2 here is substantially different and also substantially more complete, which is nice. So if you take a look at this up close, of course, we've got rivets. We've got rivets all the way back here. And this was actually not so much a stamped receiver as a receiver made from a piece of square tube stock, which makes sense, easily available off the shelf. It also has a turned down surplus Browning M2 barrel with a ginormous muzzle brake on it. Gas tube is sort of loosely fitted here, stays in place as long as you've got the bolt carrier in there. This is very much a proof of concept. Well, I guess it's one step beyond a proof of concept gun. Very much still an experimental gun of let's figure out how to actually make something like this work. It does actually use an AK recoil spring guide with an added extra spring at the front there. And then we've got an added buffer back here. That comes out with a heavy buffer spring. And then we can pull the bolt back. There was actually never a charging handle on the bolt. Still just very much a test bed sort of design. This is going to... There we go. The bolt lifts out kind of like an AK bolt, but then we have to do some sort of fiddly games with the bolt head in order to get it out of the receiver. All right, that. You then rotate the bolt carrier upside down and it'll come out. And pull the bolt out. So it disassembles like an AK. You may notice triangular bolt head. So 3 large locking lugs. The extractor is no longer in this one. This is one of the areas where this has some significant variation from a true Kalashnikov, which of course has a very different style of locking lug design. And the reason for that is simply when you get up to the scale of 50 BMG and combining the geometry of the locking lugs with magazine feed, the triangular bolt design is just almost a necessary adaptation. If you look at other 50 cal self-loading rifles, if you look at the Serbu, if you look at the Barrett, if you look at the Leader, they all use this sort of triangular bolt head. And so it's a concession to reality and practicality to not just try to slavishly copy the AK design but bigger, but instead go to a bolt head that makes a lot more sense. The cam here is welded on. They initially had a pin with an M14 roller lug on it, and the impact of firing just continuously broke M14 roller pins. So they ended up eventually abandoning that. You can see there's where the pin was originally on the other side, welded on a shaped AK pattern cam lug instead, went with that. You can see here you've got the rotating cam in the bolt carrier. The gas piston, this is kind of entertaining, was adjustable for length so they could tune it to the length that they needed, and then the jam nut that holds it in place is actually an AK muzzle nut. With the bolt carrier out, the gas tube just comes off, and that's a very simple, just plain piece of tube for a gas tube. The front trunnion here has, you can see the triangular opening for the bolt, and then there are locking recesses cut inside there that the bolt locks into. Functions very much, I mean, it really is a large AK style trunnion. You can see that the receiver is bent into guide ribs or guide cuts in the front trunnion there, riveted in place. Not the world's prettiest rivets. This is why this is version 2 and not a more complete further version. I asked why the SpongeBob tape. The answer is this uses an AK mag release, kind of on a little extender here, and it wasn't good enough. Under recoil, this would actually drop the magazine from the force of recoil. And they made a sort of half-hearted attempt to tape the magazine in place, having typically, predictably perhaps, SpongeBob SquarePants tape. That didn't work either, so they just slapped it on the side and it kind of became a thing and stayed there. But fire control group is standard AK, the grip is an AK, the mag release is AK. To me, it's actually kind of impressive how much of this are actually AK parts. I would expect zero compatibility with original AK parts, but you know, it actually works. Of course, the fire control pins are new because they have to be longer because the receiver is bigger. But I mean, you look at this internally, it is very much an AK structure. You got 2 guide rails spot welded in. There's your fixed ejector. The magazine that this was built around is the Barrett M82 magazine. That is the obvious go-to magazine to use. Magazine design is one of the hardest elements of firearms design. Having an existing, reliable, available, good magazine is a huge boon to any sort of project like this, and it makes absolute 100% sense to just use standard Barrett mags. So that's what this did. V1 actually, I believe, used a Barrett mag as well. V2 used a Barrett mag. And then this is the condition at which that the V2 got to. So it never had a top cover. You can see it's got the lug here for mounting on a tripod for test firing, and then there's a similar lug bolted onto the back, kind of extended out like that, just so that it was long enough to fit on the Bren tripod that they were using. That's as far, like, this never was to the point of being a shoulder fireable rifle. Never had a bipod, never had a top cover, never had a buttstock on it. It was this as a test bed. So with version 2 mostly working now, they've escalated, improved from like it would fire but not feed to it'll feed almost a full magazine most of the time. Now, like everything that can be learned and can be done with the V2 receiver has been done and has been learned. And it's time to start with a third brand new gun. And that's where we get the V3. And at this point, the design has evolved, the understanding of the system and the engineering has evolved to the point that the design crew, which is now Brandon Herrera and several of the Brass Valley guys, and then some other friends and colleagues and consultants, people who are interested in the project. It really is a relatively large team effort to put this together. They've gotten to the point where they understand how to make the gun work, and now they want to make one that not just works, but also looks good. And that's where V3 comes in. So let's take a look at this, because it really is remarkably impressive. All right, this thing is, I have to say, quite impressive. I hadn't seen this in person myself, and getting a close look at it, it's pretty cool. So we still have the 10-round Barrett mag used to feed, an obvious and excellent choice, of course. Then, like, this carries over really a surprising number of AK design elements, AK aesthetic elements. A few things that are different. First off, it doesn't have a dust cover safety lever. Just scale-wise, like the safety dust cover thing doesn't scale up very well to fit this sort of rifle. Now, they were experimenting with a sliding dust cover here, kind of like you find in the Saiga 12. And you'll see on the bolt carrier a few design characteristics from the Saiga 12 for that sort of thing. This isn't a final design. Something like that is probably still coming, but it's not on this model. Just point out a few other elements here. Bulged front trunnion, because it's a freaking enormous 50 cal barrel. And again, AK visual cue there. A single piece monolithic aluminum handguard that's actually held onto the receiver by a taper pin here, which is a pretty cool design feature. We'll get to that in a moment. We've got the gas block up at the front, barrel, muzzle brake. I think really the thing to do at this point is just dive into the disassembly. It is intended to be a toolless disassembly, and it almost is. So what you do to begin is pull down on this pin. And initially it had a little ring pull in it. However, the strength of the spring inside, they had to keep increasing it to keep the dust cover in place until they eventually got to the point where it's just really too strong of a spring to use with a ring pull. So we're gonna pop that down. All right, with this all the way down, I can then pull the dust cover off the back. The Trijicon can take it. There we go. So that slides up and off. And there is a folded dust cover. Like, it's pretty cool and impressive. They glued on a cheek weld that's just held in place with JB weld, but remarkably hasn't gone anywhere through several hundred rounds of firing. Lug that locks into the back of the receiver. This is a little bit simpler than a traditional AK dust cover because it's just open at the back. So it's just a two-dimensional folded design instead of having to have a much more complicated pressing at the back. All right, at this point, I can take this pin out. There we go. That is a tapered lug right there that locks into this feature on the back of the top cover and presses it forward, holding it firmly in place, which allows that rail on top to hold zero. So we have, again, a buffer spring back here. I'm going to take the buffer spring out first. That's going to give me a little more space to work with here. There we go. There we go. I can lift the guide rod out, pull out the very long double recoil spring. This then comes out, take it to there, and there we go. That's just essentially the buffer piece. Then we can go ahead and pull the bolt and carrier out. This is a much simpler piece to remove than on version 2, and there have been a number of significant design changes to the carrier. Go ahead and take the bolt out. The cam lug on this is kind of ludicrously oversized, but I mean, if it was me, I'd rather have it oversized than undersized, and it seems to be doing very well wear-wise. Blade extractor, or blade ejector, extractor here. They started simple, as many designers do, and then eventually realized they had to upgrade this thing to S7 tool steel, which is a remarkably tough steel to use, which a lot of designers end up discovering they need to use for small, high-stress parts like extractors. So the bolt carrier now has a rail down here to help control cartridges in the magazine while the bolt's cycling. And then maybe the most interesting thing is they've added a hinge. The hinge is actually out of a PK. The cutout here is taken from a Saiga 12 to help work with a sliding dust cover. And then we actually have the gas cup, or the end of the gas piston, off of a Mag 58. As a way to try and soften the extraction of the gun, they went to a Mag 58 cup out here, which increases the internal volume of the initial expansion chamber in the in the gas block, and sort of reduces initial opening velocity of the gun. So a lot more detail, technical work going into the design at this point. Also, by the way, the slot here, again, a feature taken off the Saiga 12 that's intended to go with an eventual sliding dust cover. One other cool developmental element here is that the section of the bolt carrier right here that contains this cam track is actually a separate component that is very tightly fed. It's actually hammered into place, but it's separate from the main body of the bolt carrier, and they did that because they weren't sure exactly what profile of cam track was going to be necessary, and they wanted to be able to change it without having to manufacture an entirely new bolt carrier. So it's two-piece there. Speaking of which, at this point, this has evolved a bit beyond just an ugly ad hoc shop project. And so most of in fact, pretty much all of the main pressure-bearing components were shopped out to professional CNC manufacturing shops. So the bolt, the carrier, the front and rear trunnions, or at least the front trunnion, this handguard in particular, all went out to professional shops to be manufactured, and in the case of things like the bolts, heat treated. If you watch Herrera's channel, you may have seen some of the story about this handguard. Like, it's a single monolithic aluminum handguard that is kind of ludicrously complicated. And they did a collaborative effort with a company called Titans of CNC that wanted to showcase their ability to make ludicrously complicated parts. And so it actually worked out to be a fairly symbiotic relationship where they were able to specify some weird stuff like this. Titans of CNC was able to make it and use it as a promotional thing for their own business. So that worked out nicely for them. The barrel at this point is no longer a turned down surplus M2 barrel. It's actually a match grade precision 50 caliber barrel blank that was then turned down to the specific desired weight, and also given a couple of different patterns of fluting. Looks cool, reduces weight a little bit. By the way, the markings on the trunnion here, AK50 V3 serial number 1. Taking a look inside the receiver, we still have really an AK receiver. The fire control group is still actual AK components. The pistol grip assembly is still an actual AK component. It is a Zenitco one that I think looks pretty ugly, but I guess it fits the style of the rifle. The pins, again, have to be made longer, and in fact, they've added support brackets to the outside, because without those, the longer pins immediately started bending. Because in theory, if you were going to make a solid pin this wide, you would want to make it larger in diameter than standard AK pins, at which point they would no longer fit in the standard AK fire control parts, etc., etc. This sort of stacking, cascading problems. And the solution there was you add support so that you can then use the original diameter pins. The handguard is still a bit of a work in progress. It is held in place by a tapered screw that pulls the handguard in against the trunnion, which locks it up nice and tight. It's a solid aluminum handguard, so the top rail on this, unlike traditional AKs, I suppose, will actually hold zero very, very well. It's just complicated, and it's a little sticky to get apart. Apparently, it was really nice and smooth when it was brand new, and now with a couple hundred rounds worth of carbon distributed across it, it's rather difficult to get apart. So we're going to leave that on there. There's frankly not a whole lot to see. You've just got a gas tube, barrel, gas block, just does normal gas block things. It's an AK gas block. And then muzzle brake on the end, held in place by actually an AKM plunger pin right there. So there are a lot of Easter eggs of AK, like actual original AK components built into this guy. In fact, there's another one in the recoil spring. This is not an actual original AK spring guide. It's significantly longer, but it works the same way. And they use the end cap from an original AK spring guide as the end cap, because why not? It needs to do the exact same job. Here's one more neat feature, a weird screw on the side of the front trunnion. What is that for? Well, that is essentially what you call a bump pin. So on a 100 series AK, like this Saiga, you have a little pin in there that is a special flattened out rivet, and its job is to essentially bump start the bolt to force it to begin rotating once it gets to that point in its cycling. You don't want the bolt to rotate while it's going across the magazine and starting to feed. You do want it to rotate once it gets to that point. So that little bump is there to push the bolt out of its straight track. This screw is the exact same thing for the AK50. And I don't think I can quite get, oh, there it is. So right up above my finger there is a much larger version of the same sort of thing to do the same job, and it's a screw on the outside instead of a rivet here. So this thing is way too large for me to fit all in one camera shot, so this is the best that we're going to be able to do here. But there it is. There is the version 3 of the AK50, all field stripped out for you. So at this point, version 3 of the gun is pretty solid. Like, it's not that, you know, I've put 10,000 rounds through it flawlessly without a single malfunction. It gets the occasional malfunction, but it's got about 500 rounds through it. Considering that this is still, in every sense of the word, a prototype gun, That's pretty darn good. And frankly, almost like 9 years of development work to get to this point is pretty kind of on the ball for most firearms development. People think this stuff's easy. It is, in fact, not easy. So V3 is not a complete finished product. I asked the guys here, like, so what would you change for a version 4? And they pulled out the book of things that need to change, which really doesn't include anything fundamental, but it includes a smorgasbord of small detail changes. The little things like this radius is cut at not quite the right space, and we need to change it a little bit because we're getting wear on this part. Or the lockup for the front magazine lip isn't quite big enough, so it's a little finicky to get the magazine in. You know, it works, but it's a little finicky, so we need to adjust this and adjust that and tweak this. And that's where this gun now sits as of basically late 2025. I'm not entirely sure what the future plans are for this. That's something that's frankly up to Brandon Herrera to decide if this will become a commercial item or a limited production commercial item, or if it's just going to remain his one-off fun project. So time will tell. It was very cool of him to give me the opportunity to show you guys all 3 of these. I think this is actually like the most disassembly that has been published on the version 3, and probably the only time that the whole sequence of experimental iterations has shown up on camera. So thanks, Brandon, for that. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.